because you asked me to this, we're living in interesting time, whether it's coming from China.
Yeah.
So I looked around. I can't see exact the origin of the Chinese, but I do find that there is online, there is some circulating saying there is some curses, the three Chinese curses. So one is called the may you live in interesting times, and the second is may you recognized by the people in high places, and the third one is may you find what you're looking for. Now, why is it called the curses? Is because you can say all three of them is basically be careful what you wish for. Now there are
Yeah.
Chinese saying for that. I think probably
Right.
many culture would have something like that, right? May you
Yes, I
live
did
in
know that.
interesting times. Well, it could be interesting time, but maybe it's not something you can really handle. Okay.
Oh, right.
And may you recognized by people in high places. Well, sometimes the government pay attention to you. Do you really want that? Okay.
Yeah.
And then of course be careful what you wish for. It may
Yeah.
come true, but maybe that's not what you expected. So
That is
I would
interesting.
say probably the origin is
Yeah.
somewhere when there's some Chinese saying, be careful what you wish for, and then it
Yeah.
evolved over time or something. So
Yes. Yes.
that's the
I just
origin.
wondered whether it was a case of Western Orientalism. I mean, there's
Yeah,
so much of it, to be honest, especially about China, by the way, more so than about any other
country.
country. It's very strange.
Hmm.
Um, the way the Westerners translate Chinese place names, I think I've discussed this before, is another example of this. I mean, they orientalize them. So
Yeah.
when they make translations, so the gate of heavenly peace, for
Hmm.
example, which Tiananmen,
Yeah.
but
Hmm.
I mean you can translate it that way. But
Yeah.
I think the Chinese is much more straightforward, and I think talking in it, translating it in that way, sort
Hmm.
of gives a kind of, I don't know, Orientalist romanticism,
Yeah.
which I think doesn't convey the
Hmm.
force of the original in Chinese.
And even the dragon is not the same thing. The Chinese
Oh, of course, it's
alone
completely
and the Western dragon, they're not the same thing.
completely different. They're
Yeah.
completely different. There's
Yeah.
there's really no resemblance at all. And
Hmm.
I've
Yeah.
discussed how the the Huangdi, the emperor.
The emperor and the
Eh,
Huangdi are not the
The
same thing.
emperor, an emperor is a completely different concept from what in the Chinese Huangdi was.
Yeah.
It's completely different.
Yeah.
But
Etc. Yeah.
yeah, it's all things like this. Yeah.
Yeah. And talking about living in interesting times, it's true. We are living in very interesting
Say that
times.
again. Say that again. Gosh.
But
Yeah.
but I have to say, it is unsettling. It seems like everywhere is escalating, right? It seems.
Yes, I know. Yeah. Well, Garland Nixon is a great friend of mine. He
Mhm.
said to me very early on that this is a very dangerous administration, and so it's turning out.
Yep. Yep.
Mm.
So let's start with the
Let's not.
China situation. Okay. Shangri-La dialogue. Okay.
Mm.
The, you see the Chinese, both the government and the netizens, just never quite like this idea that you are hosting this. In this case, is IISS, which is a think tank. They're hosting this thing called Asia Pacific, Defense Minister Summit.
Mm.
But why is United States even invited? You see, this has been this question, and in this year particularly, not just the U.S. is always getting invited. They invited Zelensky and Marcos Jr., who is not a defense minister. So China doesn't really like the format of it. They see this
Mm.
as some kind of a hostile, kind of like get China in particular the recent years. It's almost like a forum to pressure China. Is that how you see it?
It is absolutely that, and of course, it was completely hijacked this time with the Americans, and of course, the Ukrainians coming along. And I mean, you're absolutely right. What was the Ukrainians? What were the Ukrainians doing there? Why was Zelensky there? What I
Yeah.
will say is this: my brother-in-law has lived in Singapore for a long time. He no longer does, by the way. He's now living in China, incidentally. But um, he became very aware of the situation in Singapore. And of course, since Singapore is a financial hub, and the pressure it is coming under from the United States is incredible. Apparently, I mean the Americans are trying to bend Singapore in every conceivable way that they can. And I think that the Singaporeans who do not want to get on the wrong side of the Americans say, well, all right, let's just have all of these people over, the Ukrainians as well. The Americans are a part of the Asia Pacific, so let's have them. Well, I think the Americans participate in these things anyway, but let's have the Ukrainians too. We'll get the Americans off our back. It won't really mean anything. China's a big country. It can cope with it. And at the same time, we don't have to fear that the Americans will come and say, well, you're siding with China against us.
Yeah, well, and and not only that, but I think because China feel like this is kind of like a pressure on China, almost like putting a lot of pressure on China to, I don't know what they want, but in any event, China just kind of like not particularly like this forum. So what they did this time is much more tougher tone. I find that they use a very much more straightforward language, which I kind of like don't see that in the past. So one thing, the foreign minister, Chinese, relatively new foreign minister, Dong Jun, this is what he said when he was asked about Taiwan situation. He said, anyone who tries to separate Taiwan from China will be smashed to pieces and destroyed. Now that was over the Chinese social media. It was like the clearest message you hear from a Chinese official. What's your take on that?
Yeah, absolutely correct. But of course, this is exactly the predictable result of increasing the pressure. I should say that the United States is going to increase the pressure on China, irrespective of what China does. If China tries to be conciliatory, the Americans will increase the pressure because they will see this as weakness. They'll increase their demands. They will take further steps. They'll say the Chinese are bluffing. The Chinese never bluff, by the way. That's an iron law of diplomacy with China, which I have been following for many years, going all the way back to the 60s. And the Chinese never, ever bluff. And that's something people do need to understand. But I think that the Chinese have come to understand, and I think they're right, that whatever they say, however they approach things, the Americans are going to come down hard on them, at least for the time being. So the important thing is to remove doubts from the American mind to the extent that China can. And since the Americans are rude and aggressive whenever they talk about China, well, China is not rude or aggressive, but it is very firm.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess they come to a point that China simply has to spell it out, right? You can't just be polite and all the time. And then of course in the meantime, the tension is high in South China Sea. The US, South Korea, and Japan, they are they're planning to conduct a regular military drills. I think they just did that in April or something. And in the name of freedom, they call this freedom edge. And they always like to talk about freedom of navigation, right? Now, when I think about freedom of navigation, I think about cargo ships or cruise ships. But in the U.S., they're talking about they use warships when they talking about freedom of navigation. And sometimes because there's military bases, they even have fighter jets, etc. For their drills. Very provocative, isn't it? But what's the goal of this?
Well, it's to intimidate. It's to intimidate and to establish a presence close to China and to get China to accept that presence. Because that's what the Americans do. If China doesn't respond to the presence of those American warships, the Americans will send more and more of them. And, they'll press China further and further. And of course, this is the South China Sea. It is the major ocean route through which through which China conducts its overseas trade. So, of course, this is an area of enormous strategic interest for China. And when the Americans talk about freedom of navigation, you're absolutely right. They're interpreting it in a completely strange way. They don't accept that they will never accept that their military actions are provocative and they will always extend it to include warships. And they don't actually discuss civilian, merchant, commercial traffic. And there's a very, very simple reason why they don't. Now, I have never heard of China intercepting or seizing a single commercial ship. I've never heard it happen. I don't believe it has ever happened, at least not in the last 30 years. The Americans seize ships, merchant ships, all the time. They do that in the Persian Gulf. They do that in all kinds of places. They're constantly arresting, as they call it, even though they have no powers of arrest. They're constantly arresting, in other words, seizing ships, arresting captains, removing cargo. They do this all of the time. And it is the Americans also who talk about imposing blockades. If we're talking about China specifically, they've been talking ever since the last years of Obama about establishing a naval blockade of China in the Malacca Straits, which I have to say I think is insane, but they have been talking about doing that. So they don't actually believe in freedom of navigation. You need to put aside what they say and look at what they do. What they're trying to do is use their naval power, which is still very great, in order to pressure and intimidate other countries. And of course, they're trying to do this to, of all countries, China.
Yeah. And it's always interesting to me because China, is the largest trading partner with 140 countries. Why would China want to jeopardize anything, right, on their trade route? So it serves China's best interest to have freedom of navigation for everybody,
Well,
including China, right? But
you're of course absolutely right. You say, why would it serve China's interests? It doesn't serve China's interests. That's not what the Chinese have ever threatened to do. As I said, I cannot recall an instance in recent years where the Chinese have seized a ship on the high seas. The Americans do this all the time. I cannot recall an instance where the Chinese have threatened to impose a naval blockade. The Americans do this repeatedly. They did it against Iraq. They did it against the former Yugoslavia. They're talking about doing it against Russia in the Baltic and even the Black Sea. They do this, they talk in this way constantly. But China, of course, has no desire to do that. Either way, one of the reasons why China is the world's biggest trading country in commercial and real goods is precisely because it doesn't threaten to do these things, which is why people trade with China, because they know that China will never impose sanctions or economic blockades or embargoes or any of those things upon them. They feel that if they deal with China, they're dealing with a reliable and trustworthy partner. No one can say that about the United States today.
But it's interesting, they're always saying that, navigation freedom and freedom of navigation. They're always saying that. It sounds like China is the one who's not respecting this freedom of navigation. They're really good at their propaganda because they are actually, I know people, Americans who actually believe that. I mean, he even had this conversation with me saying, China is a bully, etc. And I asked him, so what did China do? Right? China, it serves China's best interest to have a safe, trade route. Why would China want to destroy, threatening anyone? Well, he didn't have an answer to it. So, but they heard the government, the media, the mainstream media saying that. They just get that impression. Some people do, like China is the bully, which doesn't make any sense, right? It doesn't serve China's interest. So
Well, it doesn't make any sense. It's not what China does, but the United States uses this word freedom, which is the key word. They use that word freedom and they link it always to themselves. So whatever the US does, it's all in the cause of some type of freedom, which of course applies to the US, and it gives the United States the US to interfere and meddle and bully and harass and intimidate other people, but which of course never applies to them because, as I said, freedom is something they own and nobody else does.
And talking about the contradictor, there is also, I was just reading. So Biden gave an interview to Time magazine, and he was talking about Chinese economy, and he's saying that the Chinese economy is not nearly as good as it is, et cetera, et cetera. And he looked down on the Belt and Road Initiative. No surprise there. But also Sullivan at some point also talked about a small yard, high fence, so meaning trade barriers, right? But in the meantime, the head of the IMF, Kristalina, she actually talked about, she said that the biggest risk for world economy now is the trade war. She actually said that. So, I mean, IMF is the Western institution. So even the IMF is basically criticizing the US for its, high fence, small yard, or whatever. But the trade war, right? The trade barriers, it does seem like it's IMF recognize that's the risk for the world economy, right? Is
Well,
that?
of course, that's absolutely correct. And of course, it's entirely understandable because the IMF, the central banks in the West, which are all completely against this, the various people who work in the commerce departments, the business people, they're all against this because they deal with the economy. Because when Sullivan talks about, small yard, high fence, and all of that, he's not interested really in the trade issues. He's interested in the geopolitics. It's not about trade ultimately, or about business, or about those kind of things. If it was, the United States and China would very quickly come to terms because the trade between them is so much in the mutual interests of both. It's about power. It's about the United States wanting to preserve its position as the world's leading country, deciding that China, because it's big and rich and getting bigger and richer, is some kind of threat to itself, for which, by the way, there is no evidence, but that's what the United States thinks. So, of course, they come after China. They try to affect its trade. They try to prevent the development of its industries, its high technology, and all of that. And of course, they come up with all kinds of explanations and excuses that it's all about trade and protecting American jobs and all of those things, when all the people who matter in the actual economic departments in the IMF and elsewhere know otherwise. They know that all this is nonsense. But unfortunately, it's the people who are obsessed with power issues in Washington who are overwhelmingly in control.
Yeah. Well, and then they also are putting the trade barriers. One thing they did is with the EV, right? They are putting, I don't think it's implemented yet, but they're certainly right now there is no EV car in the US. I mean Chinese EV car. I'm really looking forward, to one. But my question to you is this, can they really do that indefinitely? Can they really in the long run really pull all clearly the reason they have this they want to put in high tariff is so that the Chinese EV car will not be competitive. But at the same time, the US EV car is not as good. All right, it's just not as good. So you kind of like distort the competition, which against the fundamentals of the free competition, free market. And so do you really think they can long term do this, indefinitely to not allow more advanced product to come into the US? I think in the long run, it will hurt the US industry if you don't even know what are the more advanced products look like, right? You just keep them out and thinking you can do that. But the result is that in the long run, people don't even know, okay, there are more advanced things we should learn from, right? I mean, what's your view on this? Their
Well, I
policy,
mean,
Chinese EV.
whether they will do this for the long term remains to be seen. But if they do this over the long term, then it is a massive and disastrous mistake. Now, by definition, purely on the basis of size of populations, and indeed not just size of populations, but of countries that each of these two major powers, the United States and China, trade with. China has a far bigger market for EVs. Even if China cannot sell a single car, a single EV to the United States, there are always going to be many more EVs sold and built in China on the Chinese domestic market and in the many countries around the world with which China trades than will be the case in the protected markets of the United States. Given that the Chinese market is so much bigger, it's also inevitably much more diverse, and you can see that. So what will happen is that Chinese technology, car technology, will continue to evolve and develop and become more sophisticated because it must, because it is operating in a much bigger market. It has more economies of scale. There's more competition. There's more demand. There's also more availabilities for investment because China has a huge savings rate, which the United States doesn't have. And that ultimately affects the ability to raise investment capital for big projects as well. So Chinese industry, the motor vehicle industry in China is going to develop and evolve. Whereas if what you do in the United States is you create these barriers to protect your industry, it will stagnate. There will be no incentive to increase competitiveness because there are no competitors. And the American motor industry today is very centralized in a very small number of companies. So this is the biggest mistake you can make in terms of industrial planning and economic activity. America does have a big market. If it operated as part of a global market and carried out some very simple, though difficult to enact reforms to its economy, there's no reason why an American car manufacturer could not compete effectively, in other markets and in the United States as well. But doing this is going to do two things. It's going to create stagnation within the car industry in the United States. And because there's that stagnation in the United States, it means that American products in other markets will gradually disappear because people will prefer the more advanced, the more competitive, the more well-built and prepared Chinese ones. I've seen this whole story play out with Britain, which of course had exactly this policy. It had a policy called imperial preference. It protected its industries through high tariff barriers and protectionist tools. Ultimately, it had a smaller market compared to its competitors. By the time those barriers all came down in the 1960s, it became clear that what Britain had, its industries, were an industrial museum. They were decades behind the industries of the more advanced economies. And Britain went into permanent deficit in its trade in manufactured goods, whereas in the 19th century, it had been the workshop of the world.
Well, maybe that's the reason the German car manufacturer, they are against the tariffs.
Oh, yeah.
I find that's interesting, right?
Yes. Well, Germany, until very recently, has been a major trading economy. They have a completely different perspective. The German approach is probably changing, by the way, because the politics are again getting in the way. But the German approach is high investment, very, very high trained labor, and you aim to export your cars everywhere, wherever you can. It was a very different outlook. You didn't retreat into your own market, which in Germany, by the way, is pretty big. I mean, it's not a small country, but that is what they did. And that was why their auto industry was so strong. Now, of course, that's changing because we're starting to see again the same mistakes being made in Europe. They're trying to create barriers there to protect their own EVs in Europe. And again, the only result is going to be stagnation, probably even more so than in the US itself.